Most people believe the person staring back at them in the mirror is their enemy, but the truth is far more unsettling, because the real conflict is not who you are, but the silent agreement you have made with your own limitations, the quiet promises you keep breaking, and the comfortable patterns you continue to repeat while telling yourself that one day everything will change. There is a strange kind of pain that comes not from failure but from awareness, the awareness that you are capable of more, that your mind holds greater strength than your habits reveal, and that your life is slowly drifting away from the person you secretly know you could become, yet instead of confronting that gap, you learn to live inside it, to normalize it, and to call it reality. If these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours, and it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. Lesson 1. Stop waiting for readiness. There is a silent pattern that shapes the lives of most people without ever announcing itself, a pattern so familiar that it feels natural, so repeated that it feels justified, and so subtle that it rarely feels dangerous, even though it is the very force that slowly erodes potential, ambition, and identity from the inside. You do not wake up one day and decide to delay your life. Instead, you gradually learn to negotiate with your own desires, telling yourself that action can wait, that clarity must come first, that confidence should arrive before movement, and that courage is something reserved for a future version of yourself who is somehow stronger, wiser, and less afraid than the person you are today. Over time, this internal negotiation becomes so normal that you stop recognizing it as avoidance and start seeing it as prudence, responsibility, or realism, even though beneath the surface it is nothing more than fear wearing the mask of logic, whispering that there is no urgency, no reason to disrupt the familiar rhythm of your days, and no need to risk discomfort when stability feels safer than uncertainty. The Stoics understood that this illusion of readiness is one of the most dangerous traps of the human mind, because it transforms hesitation into virtue and delay into strategy, while quietly convincing you that life will wait until you feel prepared to live it, even though time never waits and conditions never become perfect. If you look honestly at your own life, you may begin to notice how many possibilities were postponed, not because they were impossible, but because they were uncomfortable. How many conversations were avoided, not because they were unnecessary, but because they threatened your emotional safety, and how many opportunities were ignored, not because they lacked value, but because they demanded courage you were not yet willing to claim. What makes this pattern tragic is not the absence of talent or intelligence, but the gradual surrender of agency, because each time you choose to wait instead of act, you reinforce the belief that your future depends not on your decisions, but on circumstances, and slowly you begin to see yourself not as a creator of your life, but as a spectator of it. Marcus Aurelius never waited for ideal conditions to reflect, decide, or act, because he understood that life unfolds in chaos rather than clarity, and that wisdom is not something discovered in perfect moments, but forged in imperfect ones, which is why the Stoics believed that action is not the result of certainty, but the birthplace of it. Most people assume that confidence must come before action, yet the Stoic perspective reveals the opposite truth. Confidence emerges from repeated movement through uncertainty. Clarity emerges from engagement with confusion, and strength emerges not from waiting for fear to disappear, but from acting while fear remains present. When you finally choose to move before you feel ready, you experience a subtle but profound shift in identity, because you are no longer obeying the emotional state of the moment, but asserting authority over it. And in that assertion, you begin to realize that discipline is not oppression, but loyalty to the version of yourself that exists beyond fear and hesitation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, your perception of yourself changes, because you no longer see yourself as someone who waits for permission, but as someone who creates permission through action, someone who understands that readiness is not a prerequisite for transformation, but a consequence of it, and someone who recognizes that every day of delay is not neutral time, but a silent agreement with stagnation. The most unsettling truth is that if you continue waiting for readiness, you will not remain the same person indefinitely, because identity is shaped not by intentions, but by repeated behavior, and over time the habit of delay becomes character, the character of hesitation becomes destiny, and the destiny of hesitation becomes a life that feels safe on the surface, but hollow at its core. To stop waiting for readiness is therefore not a motivational decision, but an existential one, because it requires you to confront the uncomfortable reality that the future you admire will never arrive unless you begin acting as that person before you feel emotionally qualified to do so, and that the cost of waiting is not temporary discomfort, but permanent regret. In this sense, Stoicism does not promise comfort, because comfort is often the enemy of growth, but it offers something far more demanding and far more liberating. The realization that the moment you stop waiting for the perfect version of yourself to appear is the moment you begin to become that version through action, through resistance to fear, and through the quiet courage of moving forward without guarantees. Lesson 2. Accept being misunderstood. One of the most exhausting struggles in human life is not failure, rejection, or loss, but the constant effort to be understood by everyone, because the desire to be understood slowly transforms your life into a performance where every decision must be explained, every ambition must be justified, and every change must be softened so that others feel comfortable rather than threatened. From an early age, you learn that approval often comes with conditions, that belonging often requires conformity, and that love is sometimes offered only when you behave in ways that fit expectations. So without realizing it, you begin to shape your identity not according to your inner truth, but according to what feels acceptable in the eyes of others. And over time, this adaptation becomes so natural that you forget it was ever a compromise. The Stoics understood that the pursuit of universal understanding is not wisdom, but dependence. Because the moment your sense of worth depends on external validation, your freedom quietly disappears, and your life becomes a negotiation with opinions you cannot control. Opinions formed by people who do not share your struggles, your responsibilities, or your long-term consequences. If you observe your own behavior honestly, you may notice how often you explain your choices even when no explanation is required. How frequently you hesitate to pursue your ambitions because they might disturb others, and how deeply you fear being labeled selfish, strange, or unrealistic when your decisions begin to reflect your true priorities rather than collective expectations. To accept being misunderstood is not to reject connection or empathy, but to recognize that genuine growth will always disrupt familiar patterns, and that anyone who evolves beyond the limits of collective comfort will inevitably appear confusing to those who remain attached to stability, routine, and emotional predictability. As you gradually release the need to be understood, something subtle but powerful begins to change within you, because you stop performing for invisible audiences and start living according to internal coherence. And in that transition, you begin to realize that misunderstanding is not a sign of failure, but often a sign of independence, because only those who follow familiar paths are easily understood, while those who carve new paths must accept solitude, doubt, and misinterpretation as the price of authenticity. Stoicism teaches that external opinions belong to the realm of what you cannot control, and that anchoring your identity in what you cannot control is not humility but vulnerability, because it places your emotional stability in the hands of others who may never fully see, understand, or value your journey. When you embrace the possibility of being misunderstood, you experience a quiet form of liberation, because you no longer need to dilute your truth to maintain harmony, and you no longer need to sacrifice your evolution to preserve approval. And slowly you begin to understand that clarity within yourself is far more valuable than agreement from others, because agreement fades, but inner alignment endures. In this realization, you discover one of the deepest Stoic insights. The courage to be misunderstood is not rebellion against society, but loyalty to your own becoming, because the person you are meant to become cannot emerge fully in a life spent explaining, justifying, and apologizing for your own existence. Lesson 3. Curate your mind. Most people believe their thoughts belong to them, yet if you look closely, you will realize that much of what you think, fear, desire, and judge was never born inside you, but quietly planted through endless exposure to voices, images, opinions, and narratives that you absorbed without resistance, until they began to feel like your own identity rather than external influence. Every day your mind becomes a gateway through which thousands of impressions enter, not with permission but with persistence, shaping your emotions, expectations, and decisions in ways you rarely notice. And while you may believe you are choosing freely, your choices are often guided by invisible forces that have trained your attention, manipulated your desires, and conditioned your reactions long before you became aware of them. The Stoics understood that the quality of a person's life is inseparable from the quality of their thoughts, and that thoughts are rarely spontaneous creations, but reflections of what the mind consumes repeatedly, because the mind is not a closed fortress, but a living system that transforms whatever enters it into beliefs, habits, and emotional patterns. If you observe your daily routine honestly, you may notice how often your mind is flooded with noise before you have the chance to hear your own voice, how quickly you reach for your phone before you reach for clarity, and how frequently you allow external chaos to occupy the space where your inner discipline should exist, until confusion becomes normal and distraction feels inevitable. When you constantly expose yourself to conflict, comparison, outrage, and superficial validation, your inner world slowly begins to mirror that chaos, not because you are weak, but because the mind cannot remain untouched by what it repeatedly encounters. And over time, you may begin to feel restless without stimulation, uneasy without constant updates, and dissatisfied without external confirmation, without realizing that these sensations are not natural instincts, but learned dependencies. To curate your inputs is not to isolate yourself from reality, but to reclaim sovereignty over your attention, because attention is the most valuable resource you possess. And whoever controls your attention controls the direction of your life, whether that control comes from social media, algorithms, cultural expectations, or unresolved emotional patterns that keep pulling your focus toward what is familiar rather than what is meaningful. When you begin to reduce unnecessary inputs, something unexpected happens, because silence starts to feel uncomfortable before it feels peaceful, and emptiness appears threatening before it becomes liberating, since the mind that has been trained to consume constantly struggles to exist without stimulation. Yet it is precisely within this discomfort that clarity begins to emerge. Stoicism teaches that wisdom is not accumulated through endless information, but through disciplined discernment, through the ability to distinguish between what strengthens the mind and what weakens it, and through the courage to remove influences that undermine inner stability even when they appear entertaining, socially acceptable, or emotionally addictive. As you gradually reshape your mental environment, replacing noise with intention and distraction with depth, you may begin to notice that your thoughts become slower, your reactions become calmer, and your decisions become less reactive and more deliberate, because the mind that is no longer constantly invaded by external stimuli regains the capacity to observe, reflect, and choose rather than merely respond. In this transformation, you discover that curating your inputs is not an act of withdrawal from the world, but an act of resistance against the forces that seek to define your identity for you, because the person you become is not determined by grand events alone, but by the quiet, repetitive influences you allow to shape your inner landscape day after day. Lesson 4. Learn to need less. There is a hidden addiction that modern society rarely talks about, not because it is rare, but because it is universal, the addiction to more. More money, more recognition, more comfort, more validation, more experiences, more proof that your life matters. This addiction does not feel like weakness, it feels like ambition. But beneath ambition often lies fear, the fear that what you are is not enough. Seneca warned that a person who always needs more is not wealthy but poor, because their peace depends on conditions they cannot control. When your happiness requires constant achievement, you are never at rest. When your self-worth depends on external validation, you are never secure. When your identity depends on what you own or accomplish, you are always one loss away from collapse. Look honestly at your desires. How many of them are truly yours, and how many were planted by comparison? How many things do you want because they align with your values, and how many because you fear being invisible, ordinary, or left behind? Modern culture trains you to measure your worth through external symbols, and slowly you begin to believe that without those symbols, you are incomplete. The Stoics saw through this illusion. They understood that the more you need, the easier you are to control. If you need luxury, you can be manipulated by the fear of losing it. If you need approval, you can be controlled by the threat of rejection. If you need status, you can be enslaved by competition. But if you learn to need less, you become dangerous to systems that thrive on insecurity, because you cannot be easily pressured, tempted, or intimidated. To need less is not to reject success, but to redefine success. It is not to abandon ambition, but to purify it. When you learn to distinguish between genuine aspiration and compulsive craving, your life changes. You stop chasing things that only impress others. You stop sacrificing your values for temporary gains. You stop measuring your worth by standards that were never designed for your soul. As you simplify your needs, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel lighter, not heavier. Decisions become clearer, not more complicated. Relationships become deeper, not more transactional. You realize that much of your stress was not caused by lack, but by excess expectations. You were not unhappy because you had too little. You were unhappy because you believed you needed too much. Stoicism teaches that simplicity is not poverty, but power. The person who can remain content with little is not weak, but unbreakable, because their peace does not depend on fragile external conditions. When you learn to need less, you begin to experience a rare form of freedom, the freedom of not being constantly chased by desire. And in that freedom, you discover that true richness is not what you possess, but what you no longer require to feel whole. Lesson 5. Stop treating time like it is endless. There is a quiet illusion that shapes most human lives, an illusion so familiar that it rarely feels dangerous, yet it silently determines the difference between a life that is lived with intention and a life that slowly dissolves into regret. And that illusion is the belief that there will always be more time. Without consciously deciding it, you begin to behave as though tomorrow is guaranteed, as though important conversations can always wait, as though personal dreams can be postponed without consequence, and as though the discomfort of change can be delayed indefinitely without costing you anything meaningful. Yet every day that passes quietly subtracts from the finite number of moments you will ever possess. The Stoics understood that time is not merely a neutral backdrop against which life unfolds, but the most precious and irreversible resource a human being can possess, because unlike money, status, or opportunity, time cannot be recovered once it has been spent, and once a moment has passed. It exists only as memory rather than possibility. If you observe your daily habits honestly, you may notice how often you trade irreplaceable hours for distractions that provide temporary relief, but no lasting fulfillment. How frequently you tolerate situations that drain your energy simply because confronting them feels inconvenient, and how easily you postpone the work that could transform your life because it feels safer to remain within familiar routines rather than step into uncertainty. When you treat time as endless, you begin to live in a state of emotional procrastination, convincing yourself that growth can always begin later, that relationships can always be repaired later, and that personal alignment can always be pursued later. Yet later rarely arrives in the form you imagine, because life does not pause while you hesitate, and the world continues to move forward regardless of your readiness. Stoicism teaches that awareness of mortality is not morbid, but clarifying, because when you genuinely accept that your time is limited, your priorities begin to shift naturally, and trivial conflicts lose their importance, superficial ambitions lose their urgency, and the desire to live with meaning begins to outweigh the desire to live with comfort. As you internalize this perspective, you may notice a subtle change in the way you experience everyday moments, because ordinary experiences begin to feel more significant. Decisions begin to feel more consequential, and silence begins to feel less like emptiness and more like an opportunity to reconnect with what truly matters, since the realization that time is finite transforms even mundane moments into expressions of choice rather than habit. When you stop treating time as endless, you also begin to recognize how deeply fear influences your use of it, because much of what you postpone is not postponed due to logic or practicality, but due to emotional resistance, and much of what you tolerate is tolerated not because it is acceptable, but because it is familiar, and familiarity often feels safer than transformation, even when it slowly erodes your potential. In this awareness, you discover that respecting time does not require dramatic gestures or constant urgency, but rather a quiet discipline of presence, a willingness to engage fully with what you are doing rather than escaping into distraction, and a commitment to make decisions that reflect your long-term values rather than your short-term comfort. The Stoics believed that the purpose of philosophy was not to create abstract theories, but to guide practical living, and in that sense, treating time as sacred is not an intellectual exercise, but a daily practice. Because every moment you choose awareness over avoidance, intention over habit, and courage over delay becomes a quiet act of self-respect that gradually reshapes the trajectory of your life. In this way, time ceases to be something you consume unconsciously and becomes something you steward consciously, because the realization that your life is not infinite does not diminish its meaning, but intensifies it, and the person who learns to honor time not as a burden, but as a gift, begins to live with a depth, clarity, and inner stability that no external achievement could ever replace. Lesson 6. Master Solitude. Most people fear silence not because silence is empty, but because silence reveals everything they have been avoiding, and when the noise fades and the distractions disappear, they are left alone with thoughts, emotions, and questions they have spent years trying not to face, which is why solitude feels less like peace and more like confrontation. From the moment you wake up, the world invites you to escape yourself, to scroll, to respond, to consume, to stay connected, to stay busy, to stay distracted, and slowly you begin to believe that constant stimulation is normal and that stillness is dangerous. Yet beneath this habit lies a deeper truth. The mind that never rests, never understands itself, and the person who never stands alone never truly knows who they are. The Stoics understood that solitude is not isolation but clarity, because only when external voices fade can the internal voice emerge with honesty. And only when the crowd disappears can the individual confront the difference between who they appear to be and who they actually are, which is why philosophers, thinkers, and leaders throughout history have sought solitude not as an escape from life, but as a gateway to understanding it. If you observe your own routine honestly, you may notice how rarely you allow yourself to be alone without purpose, how quickly you reach for external input when boredom appears, and how deeply uncomfortable it feels to sit quietly without direction because the mind, conditioned by constant stimulation, struggles to exist without movement. Yet it is precisely within this stillness that the foundations of self-mastery are built. When you avoid solitude, you avoid responsibility for your inner world, because as long as you are surrounded by noise and opinions, you can attribute your confusion to external circumstances rather than internal contradictions. But when you sit alone, there is no one else to blame, and the clarity that emerges can feel threatening before it feels liberating. Stoicism teaches that true strength is not found in dominance over others, but in mastery over oneself, and self-mastery cannot develop in perpetual distraction, because a mind that is constantly entertained never learns discipline, and a soul that is constantly stimulated never learns resilience. So the ability to remain alone with oneself becomes not a luxury, but a necessity for anyone who seeks inner stability. As you gradually build tolerance for solitude, something unexpected begins to happen, because loneliness begins to transform into presence, boredom begins to transform into reflection, and silence begins to transform into insight, since the mind that once feared emptiness begins to discover that emptiness is not a void, but a space where new understanding can emerge. In solitude, you begin to recognize patterns you previously ignored, habits you justified, fears you disguised as logic, and desires you buried under routine, because without external distractions, the mind becomes a mirror rather than a shield. And although this reflection may initially feel uncomfortable, it also becomes the first step toward genuine transformation. The Stoics believed that a person who cannot remain alone is easily controlled, because dependence on constant connection creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites manipulation. But the person who can stand alone without collapsing develops an internal anchor that cannot be shaken by approval or rejection, praise or criticism, presence or absence. When you learn to sit with yourself without escaping, you gradually develop a quiet form of confidence that does not rely on external validation, because you no longer need others to confirm your worth, and you no longer fear silence as a sign of emptiness, since silence becomes proof of independence rather than evidence of loneliness. In this transformation, solitude ceases to be something you endure and becomes something you choose, because the person who can stand alone is not detached from others but connected to themselves, and the person who is connected to themselves cannot be easily lost in the expectations, pressures, and illusions of the external world. Lesson 7. Let go without hatred. There comes a moment in every life when holding on becomes more dangerous than letting go, yet most people spend years clinging to relationships, identities, and past versions of themselves, not because those things still serve them, but because the fear of separation feels more painful than the slow erosion of their inner strength. From childhood, you are taught that loyalty means endurance, that connection must be preserved at all costs, and that walking away is a sign of weakness or betrayal. So you learn to tolerate environments that shrink you, conversations that silence you, and relationships that drain you, until endurance begins to feel like virtue and suffering begins to feel like responsibility. The Stoics understood that not every bond deserves permanence, because nature itself is built on cycles of growth and decay. and any attempt to preserve what has already expired only creates stagnation rather than stability, which is why wisdom often requires not only patience, but also the courage to end what no longer aligns with who you are becoming. If you observe your own life honestly, you may recognize how often you stay connected to people who only know your old self, how frequently you soften your ambitions so they do not disturb familiar dynamics, and how deeply you fear becoming someone who no longer fits into the emotional architecture of your past, because change threatens not only others' expectations, but also your own sense of belonging. When you refuse to let bridges burn, you trap yourself between two worlds, unable to fully inhabit who you were and unable to fully embrace who you could become. And in this suspended state, your growth slows, your clarity fades, and your energy disperses across obligations that no longer reflect your values, until you begin to feel exhausted, not because life is difficult, but because your life is divided. Stoicism teaches that attachment to what is outside your control inevitably leads to suffering, and relationships are among the most powerful sources of attachment because they intertwine with identity, memory, and emotional security. Yet the Stoic does not reject connection, but seeks alignment, recognizing that genuine bonds strengthen the self, while false bonds quietly dismantle it. As you begin to accept that some bridges must burn, you may feel guilt before freedom, because releasing connections that once mattered forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about change, impermanence, and personal responsibility. Yet within this discomfort lies a deeper realization that loyalty to your own evolution is not selfishness, but integrity. When you allow certain relationships to fade, you create space for new forms of connection that reflect your present values rather than your past compromises. And in that space, you may discover that solitude, though initially painful, often carries a clarity that crowded environments cannot provide, because it removes the need to perform and replaces it with the possibility of authenticity. The Stoics believed that the people you surround yourself with shape your character as surely as the environment shapes the landscape, and that remaining among influences that diminish you is not kindness but negligence toward your own potential. So to burn certain bridges is not an act of destruction, but an act of construction, because it prevents you from returning to places that no longer support your growth. When you finally accept this truth, you begin to understand that loss is not always tragedy and separation is not always failure, because some departures are not endings but thresholds, and some distances are not rejections but necessities. And the courage to walk away becomes the silent force that allows your future to exist without being constantly pulled backward by the weight of your past. In this transformation, you realize that burning bridges does not mean erasing love, memories, or gratitude, but rather redefining boundaries between what was and what must be, because the person you are becoming cannot be built on foundations that belong to a life you have already outgrown, and the bridges that burn behind you are not symbols of cruelty, but signals that you have finally chosen growth over familiarity, truth over comfort, and becoming over remaining. Transformation is never loud at the beginning. It is quiet, uncomfortable, and often invisible to everyone except the person who is slowly waking up to their own strength. And if you felt something shift inside you while listening to this, remember that this moment is not an ending, but the beginning of a deeper journey toward clarity, discipline, and inner freedom. If you want to go further, choose one of the videos on your screen now, not as entertainment, but as a continuation of your commitment to becoming someone who no longer runs from truth or hides behind comfort. Thank you for walking this path with us, for questioning your limits, and for being a part of Psychresto Mind.